Okay, so now I am going to provide assistance with an additional item that you need to respond to for week 15. I've already gone over week 15 task 2AI. You do have to respond to both 2AI and 2A, and I should say lower numeral Roman 2, actually, uh, respond to both of these. Okay, so the other video already explained the other one, and of course, you're in this folder listening to this video only if you offered a definition for knowledge and cited it in your last response in the mandatory writing assignment. But now we're going to focus on your response for this part. And of course, you're going to type up and present your response to this immediately below what you come up with for the other item. So let's go ahead and read through the steps, and I will give you warnings and tips and stress certain things. So step one, of course, is read the following sections, pages very carefully and very slowly in a distraction-free environment. So you can see that you're reading the paragraph just on skepticism on page 177. That's where you get a nice little general overview. But you also read the section on skepticism in the chapter, or you read a section that is focused specifically on skepticism, but you're only reading pages to 185 to 185. Do not read the part about Descartes. Descartes is what is called a methodological skeptic, but ultimately he's a rationalist. But he's not epistemologically a skeptic, he's just a methodological skeptic, and there's a big difference, but I'm not going to get into that this semester or with you at this time. So just make sure you stop at page not prior to 185. Stop. I think it's about midway through page 185. You stop at Rene Descartes, but definitely read all the way through page 185 till you get to the part on Descartes. So that's going to give you a nice refresher on stuff that you've already read, but this time you want to read the information very carefully, very slowly, listening for the big ideas and whatnot. And remember, and I want you to remember what I said at the beginning of the semester, and that is the information presented by Lawhead in the book is the way that I might present information in the class. Like I might verbally say the exact same thing in the classroom. So I don't want you to have the mindset that, oh, I'm just going to kind of skim this. Really, it's the teacher's job to break it down for me. No. If I was in the classroom, I might word things exactly the same way as Lawhead. So a better mindset would be to have like, wow, this lecture's in writing. I don't have to take a bunch of notes and try to remember everything and follow along. Yeah, you might want to take notes, but at least it's all in writing, so you don't have to rely only on listening. Okay, now let's look at step two. So you really want to do this part first to get your mind ready for this. So really read through all of this. Do not skim it. Do not scan it. Do not rush through it. Read to learn from it. That's going to help you a lot more in working through the steps and executing the moves that I would like for you to make. So then you see that I've got a scenario. Imagine a universal skeptic, which is defined in the reading. So you'll see a description and explanation of what a universal skeptic is. Make sure you understand the difference between a universal skeptic and a limited skeptic. But that's explained within this page range. This is about skepticism general, and really what he's capturing here in this description, it's more in line with universal skepticism, but here he does draw a distinction between universal and limited skeptics, and chances are that we're all skeptical about some things. We might all be limited skeptics to the extent that we think we can have knowledge about some things, but that there are some things maybe we can't have knowledge about, or at least we can't be as certain about. So notice that I am saying universal skeptic, and that is explained, and it should be clear that when you are responding to this prompt that you know what a universal skeptic is. And so a tip I'm going to give you is that when you are writing up your response, that you quote from the definition, that you quote from the book what a universal skeptic is. What do they believe? So you imagine, you're using imagination to imagine that a universal skeptic was in our discussion board on whether or not real knowledge about the coronavirus is possible. So that's the last item that you responded to in the mandatory writing assignment. This is not about the ranking. This is not about the ranking of your what you think are the most reliable and trustworthy sources of belief. You're still working with the same passage that you were working with up here. Up here, when you were working with your response to the last item in the mandatory writing assignment, you were focusing on how you define knowledge, of course, keeping the context of how you use knowledge in mind. That is, keeping in mind the argument in which you use this definition, and of course, keeping in mind what epistemologists are concerned with. Here, you are focused on your entire passage, the same passage, but you're not focused on just a definition. You want to focus on the whole passage, and of course, part of it would be the definition. How would a skeptic respond to your definition for knowledge? What else might the skeptic say about your response? What might he break down or want to focus on, really try to maybe tear apart, or maybe he would agree with what you said. Why would he agree with that? So imagine the skeptic has read your response and has replied to it. So just like you can go and look at the discussion board to see what your peer might have said in response to your argument about the possibility of real knowledge about the coronavirus, I want you to imagine that an epistemologist, a philosopher who's an epistemologist, a skeptic, a universal skeptic, how might they respond to what you said? Now, you're not comparing and contrasting opinions, so I'm not giving you a skeptical response to the question itself, that is, whether or not it is possible to have real knowledge about the coronavirus. Rather, I'm giving you a theory, an epistemological theory or position to look at what you would say. How might a universal skeptic, so when I say what might such a skeptic say, of course I'm talking about a universal skeptic. Would they agree or disagree with your response? So unlike opinion comparisons, you should, in this particular kind of writing task, talk about whether a skeptic would agree or disagree with your response. So yes, I want you to use the words agree or disagree. I don't want to see, so it's kind of inverted. I don't want to see that you're talking about, or you shouldn't use words like similar or different or compare or contrast. So don't do that. So that would be a mistake if you do that. I do want you to use agree or disagree. So would the skeptic agree with some parts of your argument, the conclusion, a premise? Would they disagree with other parts? Would you like to say they would strongly agree? Why only strongly, not 100%? Would they agree with some of it, but not other parts? Okay, well, which parts? But you also have to tell me why. And when you're telling me why, it has to be clear that you're using information and insights from the reading. No external sources. Again, you will go to if you need, go to the course venue bar, go to the interactive book link and find the relevant pages. So any information and insights that you provide in responding to this prompt, it should be clear that you're getting it from these pages. Now, let's get into the technical moves to execute. So you must quote something from page 177, and you must quote something relevant. Notice how I say both things are relevant from pages 181 to 185, stressing again that you do not pay attention to anything from Descartes on in the chapter section on skepticism. You will have already read about that stuff. Now notice that I say relevant. So you want to pick the best quotes to create the most compelling, interesting, engaging response. When you are picking something to quote from page 177, I want you to quote no more than a sentence. Same thing from pages 180 to 185. You can cite information other than that, but you can quote only one sentence from each of those page ranges. So notice that I want you to present a quote. I shouldn't see two quotes from page 177 or two from 181 to 185. Rather, I want you to quote a statement from page 177 or a sentence. If the sentence has two or three statements, that's fine as long as it's only one sentence. Make sure you have an introductory clause. You can't just plop down a quote. So you might have to say, as indicated on page 177 of the reading, or as Lawhead states. Now, here's another warning. What you are reading in the textbook, what you are reading in those pages, that is not necessarily Lawhead's point of view. So don't tell me that Lawhead is a skeptic. Don't tell me, don't present an idea from skepticism or from Pyrrho of Elis, if you happen to draw from that part of Lawhead's discussion of skepticism. Don't tell me Lawhead's a skeptic or that Lawhead believes whatever skeptical ideas are presented. If you want to say something about Lawhead, you can say Lawhead says that skeptics, or an idea, or a skeptical idea, or an idea from skepticism presented by Lawhead. You could also just say, a skeptic might say, or a skeptic thinks, or a skeptic might claim, a skeptic might point out, a skeptic might offer the following counter argument, a skeptic might take issue with, so just be careful with that. So that's a side point, as to when you're talking about what a skeptic might say. But to go back to what I was saying earlier, when you're quoting, you need an introductory clause. In your introductory clause, do not attribute skeptical ideas to Lawhead himself. The only thing you can attribute to Lawhead is he's presenting ideas on behalf of the skeptics. So when you're introducing a quote about skepticism or what a skeptic thinks, make sure you're wording your introductory phrase such that you don't misrepresent who's thinking that you are presenting. So you can say a skeptic believes, or a skeptic might say, comma, and then you can do your quote, and of course you can use those kinds of phrases for how they might respond to your response. Notice that you're not applying skepticism directly to the question itself. So that's another mistake that you should not make. Do not tell me how a skeptic would respond to the question that you responded to in your last item in the assignment. So remember, the question was, is it possible to have real knowledge about the coronavirus? I don't want you to tell me how a skeptic would think about that. That's not the purpose of this task. The purpose of this task is to tell me how a skeptic, thinking what they do about knowledge, a universal skeptic, how would they respond to your response to the question? So if you are getting at ideas that a skeptic might present with respect to the question, it's only indirectly. The primary focus of this task is to tell me what a skeptic, from the standpoint of epistemology, might want to say about your response to that question that you were answering in your response. Notice that there should be at least one paragraph of 6 sentences. This is in addition to the two quotes. So there should be at least 8 sentences. Now, of course, I do realize that C means degree and B is above average, and some of you might be like, well, there's my 8 sentences, and maybe you make really short sentences. And so I've had some students will do really short, tiny sentences just to make sure they get a minimum amount of sentences, but that's not the purpose of me giving you numbers for sentences. The purpose is to make sure that you give enough detail, that you're precise and sufficient and clear. So if your sentences are so short, but you still meet the number, that's only somewhat helpful, because the point of the sentence minimum is to get you to more thoroughly think out your ideas, think things through, tease out connections, show implications, and whatnot. So the number itself is meaningless. It's what my number, the minimum number I give you, is intended to do that matters. So just keep that in mind. You can have 8 sentences altogether, but if they're super short and you don't show that you're trying to get in depth and really engage, then it won't matter that you have 8 sentences. That will just matter kind of superficially, but not substantially, not content-wise. All right, at least half of the sentences should elaborate, extend, explain, shed light on, and not merely summarize. So something that I've noticed in some of the opinion comparisons, and even though this isn't an opinion comparison, is that some people would present quotes and just summarize what the quotes say. But you're supposed to explain, extend, elaborate on, justify that the quotes presented, evidence of a similarity or difference. But what a lot of people sometimes do is they stop at just summarizing, which is good to summarize, that's great, but then you also need to elaborate and extend on. So the way that I want you to think about this is it's kind of similar to comparison and contrast, but it's not exactly the same. So you're using quotes from the reading to present some ideas from the skeptics, and then you're connecting those quotes, that information from the quotes, keeping the context in mind. That is the larger text from which you're getting the quotes in the book. You are telling me how those quotes show what a skeptic might have to say about your response. I suggest that you quote 1 or 2 things from your own response. So you could say on page 177, Lawhead says that a skeptic thinks blah, blah, blah. And then you could say something like, well, if he were to look at my response, he might focus on my second statement, and where I say blah, blah, blah. And then what you can do in your third sentence is connect what you quote from the skeptic to what you quote from yourself. What idea specifically from the skeptic quote might be used by the skeptic to say something about your self-quote? So it's not enough just to quote material. You have to explain how it's relevant. You have to shed light. You have to extend, elaborate, and not just summarize stuff. Okay, so that you only need a paragraph. So you don't need to like say everything and anything that a skeptic might have to say about your response. I'm telling you that if you have 6 sentences, you'll be good. In addition to the 2 quotes, there'll be at least 8 sentences. I just want to see that you can at least do one really good um, response. Again, it could be that the skeptic totally agrees with you, somewhat agrees with you, completely disagrees with you, and why. Show me a really in-depth discussion. Even if you just focus on one thing, if you go more in depth, I prefer that on one thing than trying to say a lot of little agreements and disagreements, but not really getting deep into anything. And that's another thing that I will say about opinion comparisons is that some people would just present a bunch of quotes, summarize the quotes, and they'd have this long list of quotes that are supposed to show similarity and difference, but they wouldn't do any extending, elaborating, or explaining, shedding light on that. And so be careful with that. So it's not a good idea just to say how many things can I say he would agree with or disagree with. It's how much interesting, compelling, coherent discussion can you have about what one or two things that a skeptic might say about your response. Writing iteration. There should be a good logical flow from one sentence to the next, resulting in a compelling, coherent paragraph. It says paragraphs, that should just say paragraph. If you want to do 2 paragraphs, you feel like your paragraph's getting kind of long at sentence 5 or 6, go ahead and do 2 that are easy to follow, easy to read. Try to avoid sentence fragments, run-ons, and comma splices. Academic honesty, I went over that in the last video, so I won't repeat that here. Submission, again, I went over that with the last submission, but you're posting your response to this item, the paragraph that you do for this, along with your submission for the 2 paragraphs that you do here. I hope that helps you do well.